Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I'd like to welcome you to the module on the perinatal domain of the unconscious, perinatal experiences. In the last module, we explored this domain using paintings of people who had perinatal experiences in their psychedelic sessions, in the holotropic breathwork sessions, or as part of spiritual emergency. Today we'll focus on the very important and far-reaching implications that inclusion of the perinatal domain into the map of the psyche will give us understanding of many things that current model that we are using in psychiatry and psychology cannot explain. So I coined for this domain the term perinatal. This is a Greek-Latin hybrid where the preposition peri means near or around, like in the word periscope. Periskopein means to look around. So this is describing events that happen immediately preceding birth, in the course of birth, or immediately following birth. Now, this is in and of itself a term that's being used in medicine, in obstetrics, in relation to events that happen around birth. So we hear things like perinatal infection, perinatal brain damage, perinatal bleeding, perinatal hemorrhage, and so on. Where my use of the term varies from medicine is that in medicine you would never hear the connection perinatal experiences, because there is a belief in the current medical model that the fetus does not have way of experiencing consciously birth and has no ability to create memory of birth. Now, this is very, very strange. The reason for that that is given by the medical circles is that the cortex of the brain of the newborn is not completely mature. It's not myelinized, as it is called, which means the neurons in the brain of the fetus and the newborn are not covered with sheaths made of fatty material called myelin. And this is given as an obvious reason why there could not be memory of birth. Now, this is in conflict with all kinds of other things that we know from medicine and from some other disciplines. For example, that argument about myelinization is not used against the possibility of having memories of the period that immediately follows, which is nursing. There's a general agreement that the quality of nursing can influence the entire life of the individual. Now, even more than that, there is a concept of bonding, which is the exchange of looks between the mother and the child. People like Marshall and Phyllis Klaus or John Cannell, again, claim that the exchange between the mother and the child when they are looking at each other can influence the whole future relationship between the mother and the child. So we are asked to believe that it's possible that an organism that missed somehow something that could have been 10, 20, 30, 50 hours of potentially life-threatening situation and didn't experience anything and was not able to create a memory of that process, suddenly can respond to subtleties like quality of looks into his or her mother's eyes, or quality of nursing. So this is also in conflict with biology. For example, 2001, the Nobel Prize was given to Eric Kandel, who's an Austro-American scientist, for studying the memory mechanisms in aplysia, which is a sea slug. And he said specifically that aplysia is the lowest organism that's capable of forming memories. So again, we are asked to believe that aplysia can form memories, but newborn is not able to do that. It's also in conflict with a very extended prenatal research that we already have that shows sensitivity of the fetus already in the womb. People like Tomatis, and certainly there is a whole discipline today within psychology where it's absolutely clear that the prenatal memories and birth memories can shape the life of the individual. This discipline is called pre- and perinatal psychology. So the only way I can understand the resistance of mainstream medicine and psychiatry against the possibility of memory of birth is that the event is so scary, it's so frightening that we just simply don't want to go there, and we use our intellect to explain why that event cannot be important. The cortex is not myelinized. So therapists who are working with holotropic states of consciousness, whether it's rebirthing or psychedelic therapy or holotropic breath work or some other form of regressive therapy, they see practically every day people in their workshops or clients reliving birth in great details, with powerful emotions, and also releasing pent-up physical energies, which are in the organism as a residuum of biological birth. So in the rest of this module, I would like to show you how the understanding of some really important issues changes radically, how we get deeper insights, deeper understanding, if we expand the map of the psyche just into the perinatal level. And then in the next module, we'll show the further implications that happen when we extend it farther even to the transpersonal level. So today I would like to look at major implications for four areas. The first one is the architecture and the dynamics of emotional psychosomatic problems. The second one, deep insights into human violence and greed. The third area that we look into would be religion, spirituality, mysticism. And then the last one would be deeper understanding of art. So we will start with emotional and psychosomatic problems. As psychiatrists, we usually don't ask the question, why do we have specific symptoms that appear in psychiatric patients? Why do they experience anxiety, either free-floating or in the form of what's called phobias, fears associated with specific situations, people, animals, and so on? Why do we experience compulsions? Why do we experience obsessive thoughts? Why do we have, in psychiatry, problems with violence? Why is there sadism? Why is there masochism? Why do we have depression with its specific symptoms? But also, why do symptoms cluster into what we call syndromes? Specific combinations of symptoms. For example, in obsessive compulsive neurosis, the obsessive thoughts, compulsions to certain behavior occur simultaneously with problems in relation to dirt, to biological material, and very frequently also religious problems with the deity that they envision and that they have rebellious impulses against and then punish themselves from that. Why does masochism and sadism come close? What links sexuality and aggression in the sadomasochistic behavior? Why is depression associated not only with general tendency for suicide, but attraction to specific forms of suicide? Why is depression so closely linked to mania? We don't have any explanation for it as long as we think about depression as being simply something that's a biological, biochemical disorder. Now, Freud and his followers made serious attempts to understand why we have these symptoms and syndromes, but their understanding was only from postnatal material, from postnatal memories, and those explanations were not very convincing. So I would like to show you how we get a deeper understanding if we bring in the perinatal domain. Freud had great problems with understanding anxiety, and one of the theories he had is that anxiety happens when we suppress sexual impulses, libidinal impulses. But he got into a loop because the suppression of sexuality happened as a result of emotions, and a significant emotion that could suppress libidinal tendencies, sexual tendencies would be anxiety. So this is like a vicious circle. Now, Freud, for a very, very short period of time, was toying with the idea that maybe it is the passage through the birth canal, through the narrow canal there, that is the prototypical situation, the template for future anxieties. But then he moved away from that, and actually, when Otto Rank, his disciple, came up with the theory of the birth trauma, he ended up being excommunicated from the psychoanalytic movement. So in nature, anxiety is a signal that our life is threatened or the integrity of the organism. Now, for this reason, it makes a lot of sense to derive anxiety, among others, from a situation that is life-threatening, which certainly birth is. Children might die during delivery, mothers might die, and so on. So certainly the idea that birth is a very significant source of anxiety makes a lot of sense. But when you look at the perinatal matrices that we were exploring images last time, you get a sense that even specific phobias, specific fears make a lot of sense if you link them to birth, not just anxiety itself. So I will just bring a picture here. So we first see Otto Rank, who is the psychoanalyst who first saw the possibility that birth is the source of emotional and psychosomatic problems, and wrote that book on the trauma of birth, 1928. I will now remind you of the scheme of these 4 stages of birth that we explored last time. And I'd like to say that about a couple months, I realized that it has been more than 50 years when I, for the first time, drew these pictures and presented the idea that birth is maybe very important in psychiatry at a conference on LSD psychotherapy in Amsterdam. And so in 50 years, you know, it didn't make a dent in the psychiatric thinking. So it seems like one of the most unsuccessful attempts to change a paradigm. So we'll go now to one of the classical psychoneuroses that Freud was talking about, writing about, which are phobias, or the original term that Freud had was anxiety hysteria. So here you have a list of the most common phobias. Don't get scared by all the foreign words. It's a mixture again of Greek and Latin words, where phobos in the Greek language means fear, and then the rest of these names are related to situations or animals that become the target of the phobia. So claustrophobia is the one where it's easiest to understand that this is related to birth. Typically in the work with holotropic states, you trace it back to a situation of the onset of the delivery, where the previous freedom in the womb is suddenly terminated by the contractions of the uterus. Now, when this is close to the surface, then those people come into a situation which is crowded in some sense, like a crowded subway or elevator or a room without windows, and that activates that memory. It starts sort of surfacing into consciousness, and they interpret it so that the constriction is somehow created by those close confines, and they remove themselves, and then they have some relief from that feeling. Now, the second one is agoraphobia. Agora in the Greek language means open space, square, where they did business and also political speeches and so on. Agoraphobia seems to be the opposite. People experience tremendous fear when they move from a close confine space into an open space, like a large square or a big avenue. And they go into an infantile form of behavior. They have to ask adults to help them across the street or across the square. They have fear that they are going to undress and they're going to be seen by people naked. If you study agoraphobia, you see that the agoraphobic patients are also claustrophobic, but the fear of coming out of an enclosed space into an open is stronger than the fear of the enclosed space itself. And if you remember the slideshow, we were showing that during the transition from the third matrix to the fourth, when the confinement of the birth canal is suddenly replaced by a situation where there are no more limits, there are no more boundaries, that's where people experience the ego death. When we saw the images of fire and so on, that's the transition from the third and the fourth matrix. Now then we have thanatophobia and nosophobia. What happens in these patients is that they start experiencing all kinds of seemingly medical problems. They might have, in the thanatophobia, the feeling that they're getting a heart attack, that they're getting a stroke or some other life-threatening situation. If we work on this problem with holotropic states, you'll find out that you always trace it back to situations that were life-threatening. For example, a co-ex system where there might have been some situations of near death, like a near drowning or some kind of serious medical intervention. And then on a deeper level, it's linked to birth that could have been and often is life-threatening. And then there could be even a transpersonal past life experience where the life was threatened. So the feelings are real, but they are misplaced in time. These patients experience when they start surfacing, basically for processing or potential processing, they experience it as signals of some current life-threatening situation. Nosophobia is similar. Nosos means disease. So here it's a somewhat milder form where these patients experience feelings indicating that there is something wrong with them, that they have a disease, but it doesn't seem to be so imminent, so threatening as in thanatophobia. I have to do this telegraphically, but you will get in your deepening of learning, you will get an entire chapter from my book, which is called The World of Psychotherapy toward an Integration of Approaches, and another one that's called Architecture of Emotional Psychosomatic Disorders, when this will be described in some details and expanded to all kinds of other disorders than those that I will be mentioning today. There's acrophobia, that means phobia of heights. A very, very interesting one. It's not just a phobia, but also compulsion. People who are in these high places, they have an impulse that they want to jump down, and then they get scared that they could do it and hurt themselves. This is also linked to the final stages of birth, when there is for the first time encounter with gravitation. And also there's a phylogenetic element. There are many animals deliver standing, so birth is associated with fall. And also in some cultures, women deliver standing, like in Sudan or Buddha's mother, Maya, delivered supposedly Buddha standing. The next, eichmophobia. This is a phobia of sharp objects that occurs in mothers who deliver their children. When they see a knife or scissors, they have an impulse to go and hurt the child. But it can expand beyond that. It could be an impulse to strangle the child or throw the child out of the window. The most famous case in the United States was Brooke Shields, who had this very serious form of eichmophobia and got into a conflict with Tom Cruise, who was coming from a position of Scientology and was criticizing that she should not be taking drugs. Then we have the zoophobia, fear of animals. If you remember, we talked about the images, that the beginning of birth is experienced as being swallowed, as being engulfed. So very frequently the fear of large animals is a projection of this unconscious experience of engulfment and fear of that. There are some other phobias where you have to understand the specific symbolism. For example, serpentophobia or ophiophobia in Greek language. We saw how the snakes figure in these experiences as perinatal symbols, particularly the boa constrictor snake that crushes and swallows and so on. We also saw the images of spider. Spider is a typical archetypal image of the devouring feminine, and it appears for many people when they are reliving the beginning of birth, when the system closes in the same way in which the spider web closes on the fly or the butterfly. Keraunophobia is fear of electric storms and thunder. The most famous Keraunophobic was Ludwig van Beethoven, who beautiful musical representation of the storm in the Pastoral Symphony when he was coping with this fear. in the process of death rebirth, again, it's one of the ways you can experience the transition from the third matrix to the fourth matrix. When we go into blinding light, the moment of birth is like coming from darkness suddenly into light, and there is this powerful confrontation of clashing energies, very much like thunder. So very frequently in the third matrix, the energies of birth are represented as some kind of natural phenomena, like a volcano or tsunami, for example, storm on the ocean, and so on. And then pyrophobia, you saw the images. So when a person would be coming close to the memory of birth that is represented in the unconscious as coming through fire, that would then create a fear of the fires that they see in the environment. And hydrophobia has, on the perinatal level, has something to do with the fact that the amniotic life is all aquatic. So the fetus lives in an aquatic environment, and if there were some serious problems there, they can get projected on the postnatal life on situations that have to do with water. And there could also be things that happened after birth. I remember a patient where the mother was cooking lunch and was also bathing the child in a bassinet, and then something was burning, and she ran there, and the child slid and was drowning in the bassinet. So there was a postnatal trauma related to water. Okay, so I will now move to a next very important emotional problem, which is depression. So we have in psychiatry, we have two different approaches to depression. One is trying to explain depression simply from biological factors, from biochemical factors, relating it to neurotransmitters, to receptors, and so on. And then we have the psychoanalytic interpretations that link it to the oral period. The manic depressive disorders are seen in such a way that the template for them is related to the situation of nursing in the active oral stage, which means the time when the child already has teeth. The passive one is when there's only sucking. So in psychoanalysis, this would be that we attempt to link it to the active oral period. Now, neither the biochemical interpretations nor these postnatal interpretations that you find in psychoanalysis can explain very important aspects of depression. For example, why do we have depressions that manifest as a total inhibition when the person looks like extinct? They have no interest, no initiative, no motivation. And another type of depression is agitated, when the patients might be on the floor, rolling around, tearing their hair, tearing their clothes, hitting the head against the wall. Very kind of a desperate behavior rather than the kind of a inhibited, like extinct depression. None of these approaches explains why depression is associated frequently with headaches. Why is it associated with feelings of pressure on the chest? Why is it associated with pressure on the chest, as if we are carrying the responsibility of the world on our shoulders? Why is there physiological inhibition, loss of appetite? In women, amenorrhea, for example. There are also shifts in water distribution. Even in this kind of extinct, inhibited depression, you can get biochemical indications of stress. So although nothing is showing on the outside, there is like a storm inside of the organism. In some handbooks of traditional psychiatry, you can read that this state is something like sitting on the outside but running inside. You know, the storm activity inside, but none of it is showing on the outside. So none of this can be really interpreted. Why do we have these templates? None of these systems, whether it's biological or psychoanalytic, can explain why there is this deep link between depression and mania, and also why there is deep relationship between depression and suicide, and why do we have specific forms of suicide, from violent suicide to non-violent suicide. So again, I would like to show you how you can understand this better if you take in the perinatal model. So you find out in the work with holotropic states that the person who is in this inhibited form of depression is influenced by a COEX system that involves situations where the person is victimized, trapped, downtrodden, either in a interpersonal situation in the family or actually for example, in the cellar, the way it was in Peter's case that I discussed when we talked about the postnatal biography. You know, being locked in a closet, or having eczema as a child and being bound, or the time when they were doing swaddling, where the child was really very tightly entwined into pieces of fabric and so on. And the person does not, of course, know that this is the signals are coming from the unconscious, so they relate it to something that happened on the outside. Loss of a relationship, which also is something that happens from the first matrix to the second. You are losing the connection with the mother. There could be some period of heavy stress, which birth is also. There could be a situation of feeling trapped in a life situation, and no exit situation, and so on. And this activates this whole COEX. Now, if the person who is in the agitated depression is under the influence of the third matrix, the template comes from there, so they still feel trapped, confined, but some of the energy can be expressed, as we saw it in one of the slides that we were looking at last time. Now the energy is allowed to express itself only partially. If we could create a situation where all that confined energy would be exploded, would be discharged in emotions and physical movements, shaking and so on, that would be the end. The person would move out of that depression. So it is the second matrix is a complete confinement, whereas the third matrix, the template, is partial release of the previously pent up energies. It's interesting that Freud himself saw depression as aggression that's turned in against our own person. The extreme of aggression is murder. The extreme of depression is also murder. We kill ourselves. Okay, so these are the templates for depression. Made certainly much more sense than linking it to nursing. Now, then we have suicide. How does suicide fit into this picture? Now you'll find out that people who are under the influence of the second matrix are in that inhibited depression. When they can't tolerate it anymore, they frequently tend to go for alcohol or for drugs, a tendency to mitigate these unpleasant feelings of guilt and sadness and anxiety and so on. They might go for overdose of drugs, barbiturates or tranquilizers and so on. They might feel attracted to water. I have seen in winter that patients who had suicidal impulses from this matrix had a fantasy of walking into snow and falling down and being covered, completely covered with snow. And then they had the fantasy that this would then become a very comfortable situation, almost like being in a womb, and that actually they started feeling warm. There is one kind of a non-violent but bloody suicide that belongs to this category, which was a fad in ancient Rome. People like Seneca or Petronius, they would invite their friends and they would go into a tub of warm water and cut their wrists so that they basically bleed into the water in the tub and kind of fuse, dissolve somehow experientially in that environment. Now, if the person is under the influence of the third matrix, they feel under incredible pressure. They have the feeling that they could explode the next moment. They are afraid that they lose control over violent impulses and they hurt somebody, or that they hurt themselves. So it's both aggression directed inside, which is the aggression that's coming from those contractions of the uterus, and then there's the aggression coming the other way, which is the response of the desperate biological organism that cannot breathe, and it's experiencing pain and pressures and twisting movements and so on. Now, the person who is in this kind of a state, they doesn't have the mechanism which we saw in the second matrix, which means undoing the process of birth and going back to the previous state, like from the second to the first, creating some kind of simile of the first matrix. But here, this person has the memory that after this stage, there was something better, which was the actual experience of being born. And the way that looks is there is actually an intensification of the tension to an explosive liberation that happens instantly and happens with a lot of blood and sort of the inside of the body coming out. If we had a picture of somebody who just jumped out of the window and is on the sidewalk, and we juxtapose it with the situation of a newborn child before the blood and so on is cleaned, we would see how easily the psyche can confuse those two situations. So we have the paradox that we were born anatomically, but we were not born psychologically. And we still carry that unfinished business of birth in our unconscious. And when it starts surfacing, starts coming to consciousness, then we use for the liberation out of that unfinished situation, we use the model of birth. We try to create some kind of a situation that resembles to what happened when we got out of the birth canal. So this would be the suicide where people jump out of the windows. They use firearms. They might go for a head-on collision or driving over the cliff or jumping under a train or a subway or jumping into a hydroelectric turbine. Then also some other bloody situations that are or used to be culture bound. Certainly harakiri would belong to that category. And then a culture bound situation that was thought to be limited just to Indonesia and Malaysia was called running amok. where the person would take a dagger and run into a marketplace and starts killing indiscriminately people, and typically gets killed himself or herself, or mostly himself. And of course, this, in recent decades has been transported in the West. So we see these kinds of combinations of mass killing and suicide and happening in colleges and McDonald's and so on. And then we have this new phenomenon, which is planned murder and suicide, which in the past we saw in the kamikaze warriors. And now we see it in the suicidal bombers in the Middle East, or inspired by the Middle East. And this is then combined with religious purpose. The kamikaze warriors were doing it for the emperor, who was considered to be a god, not a human being. MacArthur forced Emperor Hirohito to declare publicly that he was not God. And in the Islamic bombing, this is a promise of the paradise with beautiful rivers, trees, the black-eyed houris, great sexual pleasures, great feasting, and so on. So here the transition from the third matrix to the fourth would be an explosive release of destructive and self-destructive tendencies, and then in inner exploration, this would be followed by a spiritual experience, by emerging into some kind of a heavenly or paradisian realm. So this seems to be where the inspiration for these combinations of suicide and murder with a religious plan comes from. Now, mania then in this kind of process is seen as incomplete rebirth. We saw it in psychedelic sessions, and we saw it in the breath work occasionally on a much smaller scale. When the person is struggling in the birth canal and there's some kind of partial relief, and then like in a psychedelic session, they would sit up and take off the eye shades and just kind of a forceful euphoria. Oh, I had a great experience. You are running a fantastic program. This should be given to all politicians. This will change the world. Where is the telephone? I'm going to call my friends and we all celebrate. And then you have the very difficult task to convince the people that things would be even much better if they would go back and finish it. It's usually hanging on before the experience of the ego death, which is a very scary experience. So there is like the process continues to the point of the ego death, and then the person really is scared and just doesn't want to continue and pretends that everything's fine. It's like the whistling in the forest. Okay, so just one more thing is that in psychosomatic medicine, all those symptoms in holotropic therapy can be traced back to something that was a physical problem in the first place, rather than those kinds of explanations that you find in psychosomatic medicine, that we are dealing with psychological problems that are expressed in physical language, somatic language, or like that, heavy sadness can manifest as a pressure on the chest, or sense of heavy responsibility can give us pain in the shoulders, or problems with the stomach is that we cannot stomach something metaphorically, or that asthma is a cry for the mother. So if you're dealing with physical symptoms in emotional problems and psychosomatic problems, you can always trace it, according to my experience, to situations that involve some physical insults. Okay, so we move from here to the next area, which is the problem of violence. You know, violence and greed have been two forces that we can find throughout human history, and it got much worse than during the transition from the hunters and gatherers to the agricultural age and creation of the cities where you could accumulate possessions that then could be fought for and so on. Now, what happened now in the 20th and 21st century is that the technological development and overpopulation created a situation that's really threatening our survival. The violence, you know, becomes very, very massive and threatening with the development of weapons of mass destruction. And the greed element, of course, leads to the industrial pollution, or the sort of escalating economic growth, you know, plundering of non-renewable resources, turning them into pollution, which is the last thing that we need as biological creatures. So we are in a situation where we have to find some answer to these problems. We have to find out what we are dealing with and if there's anything we can do. Otherwise, you know, we might not survive it as a species. We might take some other species with us. So in science and materialistic science, usually a biological interpretation for human violence. We come from the animal kingdom. There is the Darwinian pedigree, and this is just a leftover from this animal kingdom. So we have various theories of the naked ape, of the territorial imperative. We have the selfish gene. We have Paul MacLean's triune brain. We have reptilian brain, mammalian brain, and then the neocortex. So basically, there's a tendency to give biological interpretation. But there's a very fascinating book by Erich Fromm that's called The Anatomy of Destructiveness, where he shows that the human aggression is by far worse than anything that you find in the animal kingdom. The animals fight or kill for food. They fight for sexual competition, and they might be defending their territory. But you don't find, massive and totally unnecessary violence in the animal kingdom. Something comparable to what was happening in Russia under Stalin, what happened in Tibet, what's happening in the Middle East, in Nazi Germany, Holocaust and so on. Unbelievable, tens of millions of people murdered for no good reason. So it's essential for us to find out what we are dealing with. And again, biology doesn't seem to be enough. So then depth psychology came. People like Dollard and Miller are trying to show that we have very complicated development, social development, and that we have a very long dependency on our parents, and that can involve a lot of frustrations of our need for satisfaction and security, and that extra human aggression, what Erich Fromm called malignant aggression, as compared to natural aggression, that this can be explained from this complicated development. But again, this is a very meek explanation for something like mass murderers, Boston Strangler or Jeffrey Dahmer, and certainly for group violence like My Lai massacre or Abu Ghraib or Charles Manson and the Sharon Tate murders and so on. and then certainly would not come close to explaining something that can take over a whole nation, like what we saw in Nazi Germany and what we saw in communist Russia. Now, if you work with holotropic states, you find out that enormous amount of aggression is stored on the perinatal level, that the hours of suffering in the birth canal, the anxiety, the pain, the pressures, the fear, and so on, generated a lot of primitive kind of a biological fury as a response to that situation. If you would take a dog or a cat, which I certainly don't want to do as an experiment, and you would do for 30 hours, you would do to the dog or the cat what's being done to the fetus in the birth canal, you would see enormous amount of responses, biting, fighting, trying to run away, and so on. So, the fetus is a biological organism. You would expect that kind of a reaction happening for hours and not having anywhere to go. So the little crying that happens after birth is nothing. It's trivial as compared to what would be necessary to actually work this through consciously. So we are born anatomically, but we are not really born psychologically. We haven't caught up with the fact that we are out. On a deeper level, we are still stuck in the birth canal. And in something like holotropic breathwork, after an hour of faster breathing, you can find yourself in the birth canal, and it's more real than being in the room where you are doing the session. The same in the psychedelic sessions. So in my first book, which was called Realms of the Human Unconscious, I described that when we experience the perinatal matrices, that what happens is that at a certain point, the experience opens up and we go from personal psychology, we go into the collective unconscious. And we see very specific selection from human history. For example, when we are reliving that second matrix, where we are stuck in the womb, there's no exit, we would see a lot of images of populations in totalitarian countries that are in a situation of underdog, downtrodden, getting a lot of abuse, and they cannot even leave the system, like the Eastern European countries or Soviet Russia and so on. If it moves to the third matrix, the images change, and suddenly there are images of revolution. Enough of the oppression, we will overthrow the tyrant. We see now the way out of it, and we will get, there is a light on the other side of the tunnel, and we will all breathe freely. That's usually the slogan of the revolutions. And then when people relive birth, then they see images of victory in wars or victory in revolutions. And I have seen, people who experienced the Second World War and so on. They actually had flashbacks. But they are reliving birth. They are having memories of what it was like in May when we were liberated after 6 years of the Nazi occupation. So I published this in this book, Realms of the Human Unconscious, and I got a letter from Lloyd Moss, who is the journalist and psychoanalytic who wrote books on the subject of psychohistory, application of depth psychology to the understanding of history, understanding, for example, the life of the dictators or leaders, presidents, and so on, and trying to explain their politics, their decision-making from their individual history, and also studying child rearing practices before revolutions, like in the Soviet, Tsarist Russia, the Soviet Revolution, or in the American Revolution, studying the child rearing practices and how they get reflected in the type of the revolution. Again, you will get a paper where this is described in some detail, the relationship between birth and war and violence, and also nuclear development. So I will just mention this, that Lloyd de Mos gave a lot of examples from the speeches of demagogues, of military leaders who were trying to take people into war, that they were all using figures of speech and metaphors that were related to biological birth. The enemy is squeezing our throat, is squeezing the last oxygen from our lungs. We cannot breathe. We don't have enough living space. Hitler's Leben, wir haben nicht genug Lebensraum. We don't have enough space to live. We need to expand, and so on. There's also the same terminology used around the explosion of atomic bombs, both the development and the testing and the actual use. So, for example, the bomb that was used in Hiroshima was carried by an airplane that had the name of the pilot's mother, Enola Gay, and there was a nickname which was painted on the Hiroshima bomb, the little boy, and the coded message that went to Pentagon after the successful explosion was the baby was born. There's also this similar kind of a birth symbolism, at least 10 other situations. Again, you will read about it in this deepening of knowledge. I don't have the time to give them, but it's a really fascinating chapter. Now, the greed, the human greed, also has a significant connection with birth. When we carry this unfinished business of birth in our unconscious, it creates a feeling of dissatisfaction, of malaise of some kind, of discomfort, so that we don't feel that we are living as fully as we could be living. And we create some kind of a future project that will correct this. How much money do I need? How much power? How much fame? What do I have to achieve in the world to really start living the way I should be living? And this sets us on a very linear trajectory towards some kind of a future goal that is going to make us happy. And then two things can happen. One is that we never achieve that goal that we think would correct that situation. It was too ambitious, or there were some difficulties or some enemies in the way. The second one is that we get there and we wake up in the morning and nothing has changed. So the project failed, and we don't say, this is a loser strategy, I have to try something radically different. We very likely set another project or make this project that we had more ambitious. It's not just $1 million, it has to be $5 million or ambitions of fame, ambitions of political power, and so on. So this is happening on the individual scale, and so also happening on the collective scale. We have this idea of unlimited growth, increasing the gross national product. This year, the economy grew only 3%. We want 4%. And actually, the reality is that the countries that are most successful are not necessarily the happiest. We have these in the Western industrial cultures. We have probably more violence. We have probably more divorce. We have more drug use and alcoholism than in cultures that don't come close to that material wealth. So again, completing this process of birth, bringing it fully into consciousness, expressing the pent-up emotions, releasing the physical energy which are still caught in our system, create a greater ability to enjoy the present moment and less of this kind of blind drive into some kind of a future goal, what has to change for me to or us to feel comfortable. So I will just go very quickly into the next one, which is the religion. And I think you will understand already from what we discussed in the previous modules that this perinatal dynamics, which underlies the process of psychospiritual death rebirth, is a critical element in the spiritual and ritual life of humanity. We would not have religions without people having perinatal experiences, and then we'll talk more about transpersonal experiences. The religions were all inspired by very powerful experiences of the founders, of the prophets, of the apostles, and so on. They all had perinatal experiences of death, rebirth, second birth, vijja in Hinduism, or in a variety of transpersonal experiences, oneness with God, kind of angelic visions of various kinds, past life experiences, the way it happened to the Buddha, experiences of paradises and heavens and hell, the way it happens to Muhammad, the way it happened to Saint Teresa of Avila, the way it happened to Saint John of the Cross, the way it happened to John of Patmos with the vision of Apocalypse and so on. So again, psychiatry will never understand what spirituality is about, what mysticism is about, what religion is about, if we have this superficial meek model where our psychological history starts after we are born. We have to include the perinatal level and the transpersonal level to get really some understanding of what spirituality and religion is about, the numinous experiences. And the last thing I would like to mention is the understanding of art. I actually wrote about it in my last book, which is called Modern Consciousness Research and the Understanding of Art, when I start by describing the attempts of Freud and his followers to explain art using the postnatal model. And you would see that the attempts were really very, very unsuccessful. Freud's explanation of Leonardo da Vinci, his explanation of Dostoevsky, those were criticized even on having false data, not only a very superficial approach. So I tried to show on an article which was written by Tom Riedlinger called Sartre's Rite of Passage, how much of Jean-Paul Sartre's philosophy and writing was influenced by very poorly managed mescaline session, which he had, where he spent several hours in the typical imagery of the second matrix and never really resolved it, so that how these elements that you can understand from the second matrix are really seriously influencing and informing this work. I also showed how you would understand Edgar Allan Poe much better than Marie Bonaparte was able to do in an otherwise beautiful study on the life and work of Edgar Allan Poe, but using just the model limited to what happened to him after birth, not including the perinatal, not including the transpersonal. So if you're interested in this, this is a book that was published by MAPS publications. There's a lot of images of the kind that you saw in the slideshow, but also many others that talking about how psychedelic research influenced art and the understanding of art. And then I'm using as a major example Hans-Ruedi Giger, whose paintings you saw in the slideshow, showing there's no way of understanding the art of Hans-Ruedi Giger without bringing in the perinatal level. There's also a way of understanding some of the blockbuster movies that are loaded with these perinatal images. If you think about the scene from Star Wars, when the heroes are running away from the Imperial Guards and they end up in this junkyard where there suddenly is a swamp and there is a kind of alien octopus that gets Luke Skywalker, and they finally manage to zap him or it and get rid of that danger. But they found out that the whole room is kind of contracting and they are gonna be crushed. And R2-D2 is working on it, and in the last moment he stops the process. They are able to escape and save their life. So Def Sparks, who's coordinating the breathwork training, is doing something called movie yoga, and actually wrote a book called Movie Yoga, how you can actually use scenes from the movies for introspection and self-exploration. If you pay attention to how you respond to various situations in the movies, that will tell you where you are somehow unfinished in terms of dealing with your unconscious, including the perinatal unconscious. And I will be mentioning later the amazing scenes that you find that involve transpersonal visions, like Lord of the Rings and so on. So let's see, we have used our time, but I will show you something that really is an example of how this process of psychospiritual death rebirth informs art. And we'll look at Joseph Campbell, who wrote this wonderful book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces. And there he has the concept of the hero's journey that he found in many different cultures, mythology that described the situation of people who might have been gods, demigods, but also ordinary people, who suddenly get into the world where all kinds of strange things are happening. Strange creatures appear, they are subjected to great challenges, they might be killed and reborn, and then they return back. And he found the same pattern in rites of passage that we already talked about, where you have process very similar to these perinatal matrices, when there are three stages. One is separation, when the group of initiates is separated from the rest of the tribe. Then you have the transition, when they are put through some mind expanding procedure, when they experience death rebirth, and then they return into the tribe, so it's incorporation. You find something similar in the ancient mysteries of death and rebirth, and you find it also in art. So this is Joseph Campbell, brilliant mythologist, and probably the greatest mythologist ever. And he gave wonderful talk on the Divine Comedy, Dante's Divine Comedy. Dante was 35 years old, I think, and had the vision of this mountain, beautiful mountain, and like a symbol of the spiritual ascent. And he wanted to get to the top of the mountain. And Vergilius showed up and says, to get to the mountain, you have to go first down, and takes him to the journey where they go down to hell. We talked about the underworld journey when we were showing the slides the last time. And then it turns around, and then this is hell, and the purgatory is actually a mountain when they are climbing. And at the end, there is the mystical rows of angels. So this is a wonderful picture from the Duomo in Florence, showing Dante. And now these are the major images. On the right side is the Duomo itself, cupola, the cupola Brunelleschi. And then on the left side, you can see the entry into hell from Dante's Divine Comedy, very much like the images that we saw in the slideshow last time. And then you can see here in the middle, there is the purgatorial mountain. So if you are involved in this process, going into the second matrix always feels like going in and down. And once you're in the third matrix, no matter what your position is, it feels like you're going out and up. And Joe said about this Divine Comedy that this was a fantastic, timeless template for the death rebirth journey, psychospiritual death rebirth. But in Dante's case, as he said, it was spiced with provincial gossip, which means they were going through these different levels of hell and purgatory. And as they were doing it, Dante was then talking about his neighbors and his contemporaries, telling the stories while they are in the situation that they are in hell or in purgatory. So I have used all my time a little more, and I would really encourage you to go and look at some of the deepening learning, reading that chapter about the world of psychotherapy, attempt to integrate the approaches, creating the large map of the psyche, the comprehensive map, and see how that explains emotional problems and psychosomatic problems in a much deeper and much more logical way than either the biological theorists or psychologists limited to postnatal, the postnatal domain are able to do. And also look at that Eranos paper, which talks about the insights into human violence and greed. It has actually some of the pictures, the political cartoons and posters showing how cultures that are in some conflict in war, how they portray each other by using these perinatal images that we saw, the spiders, the leviathans, the pythons, and so on. So thank you very much for your attention, and we'll see each other next time.